All right, I am back here. We are talking World Series today with the great Joe Sheehan, a baseball contributor for Sports Illustrated. He also has his own newsletter talking all about baseball. Joe, welcome. How are you?
Good, Mike. So,
Doing pretty good. And I have to say, considering all of the angst that we had over the postseason with the expanded playoffs, I think it did work out pretty nice. We got the two best teams in the World Series.
yeah, that's not always going to happen in a format like this, but baseball caught some breaks along the way. Certainly, with these two teams, it's not just like 2014 or so where you kind of, they're good teams and maybe they're the best team. These were clearly the two best teams in baseball all season. And as we saw all October, they're great in all aspects of the game.
Yeah, I do think so too. And when you look at the matchup, what's the first thing that jumps at you between the Rays Dyers in terms of like what's something that really attracts your interest?
Well, the pitching depth is really incredible. I mean, this is a year where the pit teams use their pitches very strangely, obviously with the expanded rosters for the entire season. A lot of teams couldn't fill out a 13 or a 14-man pitching staff. And frankly, I hope we never have 14-man pitching staffs again. But the Rays and Dodgers are two teams that actually have enough good pitchers to go that deep. We saw the depth of the Rays bullpen a lot over the last couple of weeks with their use of guys like Peter Fairbanks and Nick Anderson, pitchers who are known to seam heads, but maybe not as known around, to the casual fan. And of course, the Dodgers, you look at those young arms, Dustin May, Julio Arias, who closed out Game 7, Tony Gonsolin. These are all guys that have come through their system, been developed by the Dodgers, and are now having an impact at the major league level. So that pitching depth, I think, is going to define this series.
I do too. And one thing that does jump out at me, it's interesting in the series, obviously the neutral site aspect, whereas I know weather wouldn't have been an issue if we were playing in Los Angeles and Tampa Bay, but like, what do you think the impact of playing at a Globe-like park will have on these two teams?
Well, it's lit by candles, and it has like double gravity of Earth. So I think it's been interesting watching. I mean, obviously, I watched the Rangers during the season. It's a new ballpark. It was certainly a big change for the Rangers going from Globe Life Field, which was a good hitter's park. It was outside. It had jet stream out to right field. And now going to a domed park, and they pretty much played with the roof closed most of the season. And it was a totally different environment for Rangers baseball. And we've seen in this series, you can get a ball out of this park, but you really have to get a hold of it. Ball just doesn't fly very well in this park. It's got a decent-sized outfield, but really it's about the way the ball flies. I think this affects both teams. Both teams are very reliant, I think, on long ball to score. It's going to be interesting to see how the Rays defense adapts to a park they haven't played in yet. The Dodgers have gotten to play in Arlington the last week or so. The Rays have not played with the way the schedule was this year. The didn't play any American League West games, so they'll be new to this park, and we haven't. That is not a very common thing now. Most players have some experience, even in the cross league park that they'll play in. So we'll see how that affects them, particularly in the early first couple of games of the series.
Yeah, the Rays definitely an interesting story to me, just because of the way they sort of, I think, obviously the Moneyball revolution, analytics, and all of that. They feel like the Rays sort of become the poster children for that. And one thing I think is interesting with them is just the way they sort of maximize the utility of their roster in terms of every guy has a role. It's not like, let's say, the Yankees, where if Tyler Wade is playing 3 times a week, you're in trouble. The Rays can really throw out anybody in there and sort of get something out of them. How do you think about the way the Rays have sort of utilized that roster? Is something you think that the rest of the league will start adapting in the future?
But again, you have to be careful to port things from 2020 baseball to other years, because you're not going to have the size of the roster. Baseball was supposed to go to 26-man rosters this year. They played with 28. That makes a significant difference. There was a really good piece by Mike Petriello at MLB.com talking about all of the different looks that the Rays pitchers can give you, talking about arm angles and repertoires and different velocities. I think that's going to be something they're going to look to attack the Dodgers with. You go back to the first 3 series in the playoffs. The Rays have faced these right-handed heavy teams. They faced 74% right-handed hitters, the Jays, the Astros, and the Yankees. Well, the Dodgers get about half their plate appearances during this run from lefty batters. So it's not just going to be as simple as shoving Nick Anderson and Diego Castillo and Pete Fairbanks, these power right-handers they have at the Dodgers. Kevin Cash is going to have to do a little bit more matchups. He's going to have to rely on the left-handed pitchers in his bullpen that he really hasn't used at all in this playoff run. So that, I think, is one of the big challenges. How do the Rays play against a team that has much better balance than they've faced so far?
Yeah, I do think people do forget about that Dodger lineup, considering it is very balanced. We saw some big stuff in the NLCS, like What would you think the strategy be from Dave Roberts, sort of stack his line to get the best chance against that Tampa Bay pitching staff?
Well, this is where the three batter rule comes into play. You're not as worried about stacking, about splitting up your lefties because the other batter's got to figure out, okay, do I want to bring in the left-hander here, especially against teams like the Dodgers that has all of this flexibility and all of these bats off the bench, Edwin Rios, and Matt Beattie, and guys like that. We'll see if Gavin Lux makes the roster. There's so much depth. They're very hard to manage against. But obviously the core of that lineup is that great left-handed power. You look at Bellinger, you look at Corey Seager, who's played like an MVP candidate this postseason. You look at Max Muncy, and Jock Peterson gets a lot of playing time. I mentioned Rios; he's been playing more in the postseason. It's an incredibly difficult team to plan for, and that's one of the kind of inside things I'm looking at in the series. Is does Cash stick with what's gotten him here? Does he try to play more matchup ball? Does he just work his lefties in full inning work? Are there going to be spots where Cash kind of traps himself in bad matchups that really haven't come up in the first three series?
Yeah, definitely interesting to see. I think obviously the biggest player in this series to watch in terms of like a legacy point is Clayton Kershaw. He's going to start game 1 tonight, and he's going to pitch again in game 5. The calendar holds. So, like, how big is it for Clayton Kershaw to put up a big performance this World Series, given his reputation for not being great in the postseason?
Oh, I don't know. I think at this point, Clayton Kershaw could throw a perfect game and in the middle of the 5th inning announce that he has a cure for COVID, and people are still going to say that he doesn't perform in the postseason. I think that the story now has exceeded any ability of the facts to catch up to it because Kershaw has had a number of excellent performances in the postseason. And when you actually go through it, a lot of the problem is Dave Roberts asking too much of Kershaw, whether it's going an extra inning or bringing him out of the bullpen or asking him to perform on short rest. And this has been a particular problem the last couple of years as Kershaw, he's not the guy he was in 2014. And to some extent, he's being compared to that pitcher when for 3 or 4 years now, he's been on that next tier down. He's Greg Maddux in 1999 now, not Greg Maddux in 1993. So, again, I've been a defender of Kershaw, and I think that a granular look at his performance in the postseason will show that he's been a very good pitcher. And, yeah, he's had some bad outings. You think about the one that sticks out to me is Game 5 in the 2017 World Series. But even now, do we not have to look at the 2017 World Series against the Astros in an entirely different light given what we know? So, we'll see what happens. I think anything Kershaw can do to pitch well in October helps him with marginal fans, but there's a certain core baseball fan that is always going to look at Clayton Kershaw as a choker.
Yeah, I know Kershaw's got that reputation, and I do think the guy being more concerned about right now is Kenley Jansen, who did not look great at points in the NLCS, and Dave Roberts nearly stayed away from him in Game 7 and let Urias finish the game out. Do you think the Dodgers should be careful with how they use Jansen in the series?
I think the Dodgers are going to lose. And I said this going to the Braves series. I think it's going to be in the late innings. It's going to be in a game where, like Game 1 of the NLCS, where they're tied in the 9th, and he went to Trinan, and Trinan got lit up. It doesn't seem to me it's one thing to have a closer problem in June. You've got time to work through it, and if you lose a game, it's not a big deal. You can experiment a little bit. It's very difficult to go into Game 1 of the World Series not entirely sure who's going to pitch the 8th and the 9th for you. And I don't mean that from a closes or everything standpoint. It's the uncertainty more than the pitcher. So, if I'm Roberts, I love the way he finished up Game 7 of the NLCS. Julio Urias is a very good pitcher. He was on the mound. He was pitching well. He didn't have a large pitch count. He let him finish the game. If you remember that 2017 postseason, A.J. Hinch completely lost his bullpen. You go back to that Yankee series. And all of his relievers were getting battered from pillar to post. And what he basically did was say, I'm not going to use them. And he started using his middle guys. You look at Brad Peacock. You look at Lance McCullers coming out of the bullpen. Charlie Morton in the World Series. He said, I'm going to use my best pitchers regardless of what their role is. Roberts' use of Urias in Game 7 of the NLCS could be a foreshadowing of how he might use, say, Dustin May or Tony Gonsolin or any of the pitchers on his roster, regardless of save situation, inning, or score.
Yeah, that's true. And obviously the schedule change does help you, I think, a bit for that situation personally, because obviously the first 2 rounds we were going every day, that days off, try and get through the whole thing and make sure that the postseason wrapped up before the election. And now we're back to the traditional 2-3-2 with days off calendar. Does that benefit either team particularly more than the other?
I would say probably the Dodgers, because they seem to have fewer pitchers they trust right now. So, with the Rays, just feels like they can bring out a whole bunch of guys, and they're not going to run out of pitchers. I think the Dodgers, I look at a Victor Gonzalez, who's pretty much unknown. He's a rookie left-hander, has been great out of the bullpen. They've kind of had to manage how they use him. They'll be a little more free to use their most effective pitchers, whether it's him, whether it's Gonsolin, whether it's Arias, and not have to worry so much about he's going to be available tomorrow or the next day. The Rays have better depth, and that's one of the things that's helped them get to this point. And the extra off days will probably help the Dodgers more than the Rays a little bit. It's pretty close, but I think it's a small benefit to the Dodgers.
Yeah, one thing I'd be concerned about as I'm a Rays fan is like this team does strike out a ton, and that's a narrative that doesn't seem to work too well. Like the later you get into the postseason, would you be concerned about how much the Rays are striking out on offense? Because I know they are hitting a lot of home runs, but especially now you're going to this park where it's a lot harder to hit the ball out of the yard.
I think the park is the X factor here. I mentioned earlier, the ball just doesn't fly here. These are two teams that are among the most reliant in baseball on scoring on home runs. And we saw, the Dodgers go through some stretches in the NLCS, but they just couldn't get anything going. Their offense, they had 256 this year, which was 8th in the National League. They led the league in home runs. They were 5th in the league in walks. That's how they score runs. They draw some walks, they hit some long balls. The Rays, similarly, very reliant on the long ball. So, it's one of the reasons I don't like this park for this postseason. I think that taking two teams that were reliant on the long ball and throwing them into this cave is a little bit unfair. We basically picked Arlington because it was the park with the best weather setup, it's a dome park, that the home team had no chance of being in the World Series. Like the reason we're not playing in Petco this week is because there was a chance that would be a home game for the Padres. The Rangers, there was no chance. So that's kind of a thin thing to have, be playing in this ballpark on. But I do think it's a factor of the series. And you mentioned the strikeouts. That doesn't worry me that much. Everybody strikes out now. It really just comes down to short sequence offense. Do you hit the home runs? Do you hit those home runs with a couple of guys on base?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I got some keys here. What do you think is the key to victory for the Dodgers in this series?
I mentioned the walks. The Rays are they're third best walk rate in baseball for their pitchers. And the Dodgers, as I say, their offense is very reliant on drawing those walks. Can the Rays keep giving the Dodgers those free bases? You look in that bullpen, and there are some of the Rays relievers who are very willing to give up the walk. We saw that. The Rays gave up 21 walks to the Yankees in 5 games, 29 walks to the Astros in 7 games. They will put some guys on base in that bullpen. Blake Snell will put guys on base. It's something to watch in his first start as well. So can the Dodgers draw enough walks? I think is a big key to this series.
What about the other way? What about the Rays? What's the key? What do they have to do right to win this series?
They're going to give up home runs, keep runners off base. If they can keep the Dodgers hitting a bunch of solo shots, which is what they did to the Astros for most of that series. The Astros offense was basically all solo shots for the first half of that series. And they had some long sequence runs. They had some home runs and runners on base later on. But, they shut the Astros down, not by keeping them from hitting home runs, but by keeping them from hitting 2-run and 3-run home runs. So that's going to be the element. And also, too, continuing to play that defense. These are two very good defensive teams, but no team is as good as the Rays are. When they have Margot, Kiermaier, and Renfroe in the outfield, that's the best defensive outfield in baseball. Willie Adames doesn't get a whole lot of attention. It's just his 3rd season, but he's a plus defensive shortstop. Joey Wendell, wherever he plays, is a plus defender. It's just such a good defensive team. And as we saw during the ALCS, they position as strongly as any team in baseball. Remember, Rays were an early adopter of shifting their guys around. And now they don't really look at positions. They just say, where's the ball being hit? Where's the ball most likely to be hit? And where can we put our guys to stop it?
Yeah, that does make some sense. It'll be an interesting series for sure. If you had to make a pick right now, like who wins in how many games?
It's kind of a coin flip for me. I'd probably go Dodgers in 6, and that's as much because I thought all year the Dodgers were the best team, and I haven't seen anything to take me off of that. But I don't think there's a result here that would be a surprise short of like a sweep. If one of these teams were to sweep, it would be a pretty big surprise. But if I had to make a pick, I'm going to go Dodgers in 6.
Yeah, I took the Dodgers for the season as well. I do think this is going to be a very interesting World Series. I do want to touch on one question each for the 2 local New York teams because obviously they're entering very interesting offseasons, starting with the Yankees, who did get to the ALDS, lost to the Rays in 5. They have some questions with the pitching free agents, DJ LeMahieu. There's questions about cash flow. If you were running the Yankees, how would you approach this offseason?
I'm probably the only guy in New York who doesn't want to sign DJ LeMahieu. It's obviously been great for 2 years. Second base, that size. If I can lock him up for maybe another 2-year deal where I'm limiting my exposure, I wouldn't mind doing that. It's also the question of how much longer I want to keep playing Gleyber Torres at shortstop and that great crop of shortstops that becomes free agent after next year. Would I rather stake second base for a year and then go out and sign Francisco Lindor and move Torres to shortstop? Or would I rather sign a 32, 33-year-old LeMahieu and kind of block off that option for next year? So it's not just a one-year decision for me. I'm looking ahead to that shortstop crop in 2021 and thinking about what I want to do then.
Yeah, definitely interesting with them because obviously I think there's a little bit of an appeal with them of like, oh, like, should we change things up? We keep getting close, but there's also the argument with the Nationals, like, oh, like, just keep getting there enough times, you'll break through once and you'll win. That I think you've had that argument. I think they could lean more that way, considering they might have cash issues considering they had no fans this year.
It's very hard to convince Yankee fans that the postseason is random's not the word, but it's not always just about how good you are. It's about how good you play over the course of a week, and to convince the fans that the other team gets paid too. Because the Yankees had that run from 96 to 2001 where they won, 13 of 14 postseason series. And we know now that that's just not going to happen. The Giants eventually did it by making the playoffs every other year and won 9 straight. But we know now that it's incredibly difficult to get through even one of these tournaments successfully. And to do it 2, 3, 4 times is just highly unusual. So the Yankees, to some extent, are a prisoner of that run they had from 96 to 2001, when this playoff format was new and we didn't get just how random it was going to be.
Yeah, it's certainly true. I'll go to the other side time too with the Mets. Obviously, they're going to have a new owner being approved some point after the World Series. I know he said that they're going to bulk the analytics up, which they need. They're going to be smart with things, but you figure they're going to make at least one splash this winter to sort of like signal like, hey, this is not the Wilpon era anymore. If there was one guy that you feel like the Mets had to get of all the free agents, who would be the best fit for them?
I'd probably go after JT Realmuto. I worry about how well he's going to age, but it would be a massive upgrade over their current catching situation. It was Ramos, and at one point this year they had to pull a kid up from Double-A to catch. And I know that was a weird season and a COVID thing, but adding Realmuto I think would be the one guy they should get. It's a tough winter to spend. Talk about making a big splash, and certainly we expect Cohen to do that. But if I'm him, again, I keep my powder dry. So I can go after Correa, Baez, Story, get one of those true superstar type players a year from now.
Do you think they could be aggressive on the trade market maybe? Because there have been a lot of rumors floating around New York right now about them making a run at Lindor.
Yeah, Mike, it's very hard for me to figure out right now what this winter looks like. You mentioned, we played without fans this year. We played a 60-game season with no fans. 40% of baseball revenue evaporated. And I don't know what that picture looks like for next year. I'm telling you right now, I don't think we're going to be back to 70 million fans going to Major League Baseball games for some time to come. So the trade market depends on things like how willing is Dolan to lose a couple bucks next year. What are his attendance projections for next year? It's just so hard right now to figure out how much tolerance teams are going to have for spending money in 2021, and that of course affects the trade market. Lindor would normally be somebody who would carry a pretty significant price even for 1 year. But if Dolan cares more about getting probably an arbitration, $26, $27 million off the payroll, that's going to be a different price.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's going to be an interesting offseason for sure. Joe, thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, how can people follow you on social media and keep up with some of the stuff you're up to, including the newsletter?
Unfortunately, I'm on Twitter at Joe_Sheehan, SHEEHAN. Talk baseball on there and pretty much some other stuff occasionally. You can get information at the Joe Sheehan Baseball newsletter at joesheehan.com. It's a subscription newsletter. I've been doing it for about 10 years now. You can get subscription information, read excerpts and some full pieces over at joesheehan.com. And then if you're in the New York area, just shout. I'm sure I'll be around.
All right, Joe. Thanks all the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.